In this lesson, we'll begin to look at data fetching in Nuxt. So we spent the past few lessons building out our server routes and seeing how we can do that with Nuxt with all of the different tools that comes with Nuxt. And now we'll be able to create a couple different composables which will let us access that data really easily. In this lesson, we're going to start with the use lesson composable, which will let us access those lessons. So to begin, we'll create that use lesson file. And then we'll paste our composable code in here. Starting at the top, we will pass in a chapter and lesson slug. And this is what will allow us to grab the correct lesson that we're looking for. We then make a call to use fetch. This is the composable that lets us fetch data. And it's very similar to a fetch command or the fetch command that you're probably already familiar with and using in other projects. But this fetch command is a little bit more powerful, and we'll return to that in a moment. But in this fetch call, we have our URL, which uses the slug for the chapter and the lesson slug. And then from that, we get our data as well as an error object. So before we return from this composable, we check to see if we have an error. And if we do, we can use this create error method, which we are now familiar with, to throw an error. Otherwise, we can simply return this data ref with the data that we've fetched. We'll use this composable in the lesson page instead of fetching it from the use course composable. So first we have to grab our slugs from the route. And then using those slugs, we can then pass them into the use lesson composable here. Now we need to make sure that we're using this await keyword because in our use lesson composable, we are awaiting this fetch command. And TypeScript is giving me an error now because we've already got this lesson variable defined. But now that we're getting our lesson from this endpoint, we no longer need to compute it from this value here. So we'll just get rid of that. And as you can see, as we click through our lesson here, we get the same outcome. In fact, it looks like nothing is actually changed. So to prove to you that we've actually done something useful here, I'll open up the network tab. And you can see that as we click through, we're making calls to our endpoint with these different request URLs. A different URL per lesson. And the response is the lesson object itself. So this is all pretty straightforward, actually. The use fetch composable is really easy to use. So let's explore a little bit more about this use fetch composable. One thing that's interesting about this composable is that it actually automatically will infer the type of the data that we get back. If I hover over this data, you can see that it knows that this is a lesson with path object, even though we've never specified this anywhere. And that's because it knows based on this route, it can match it up to the endpoint that we just created. When we want to type out the route, we have this autocomplete here because, again, it knows the types of the different routes that we have. And these are the only 3 valid routes that we have in our application. Right? So undo this, come back to our code that works. One interesting thing to note about this use fetch composable is that this URL here, while we have used a string here, you can also pass it a ref of a string, or even a function that returns a string, or a function that returns a ref of a string. And if you use a ref here, whenever the value of that ref changes, useFetch will automatically refetch your data for you. So in theory, we could change this from a string to a ref instead. And then in our lesson slug page here, we could create a computed prop that returns a string and then use that computed in this lesson. But I actually prefer this method here. Instead of passing in a generic string ref, we pass in the slugs, and then the composable itself will calculate what that URL should be. In this way, we don't have to carry around this structure for the URL ourselves. It's encapsulated nicely within this composable here. UseFetch isn't the only way that we can fetch data in our application. In fact, UseFetch is a wrapper around two other functions that are very useful in Nuxt. So we can create an equivalent version of this using the use async data as well as this $fetch. So I'll save this here and refresh. So you can see that as we click around on the side here, our data loads. And so these two implementations are actually functionally equivalent. They do exactly the same thing, but just with a slightly different syntax of doing it. So let's explore how this works, and we'll start with this $fetch. So this $fetch here is very similar to the fetch command that you are used to. It fetches data from a URL. But this command is isomorphic. And that's a really fancy, cool sounding word, but all it means is that it does the same thing on the client and on the server. You'll notice that a lot of the things we talk about in Nuxt actually do this, including this createError method and many other things, which simplifies our lives a lot. But in the case of the fetch command, we can use it on the client side as well as on the server, and it operates in the same way. Except there's one little catch here, and that is that when we're on the server, this $fetch will skip the whole HTTP request thing. Instead, since we're already on the server, this call here is in the same process as our server endpoints. And so this method here just gets directly called, as if it was just another function in our application. So we skip all of that HTTP overhead, which makes it much faster. One other thing that's great and that we've pointed out already is that this $fetch enables this wonderful automatic type inference. Technically, our server-side routes are running on a separate application on the server, and this fetch command is being run on the client side. And so they're actually two separate pieces of code. And so type inference between the two is not always that easy. And so Nuxt does a bit of magic for us and allows us to get this type inference. So we've explained what this fetch part does. But what about this use async data thing? Well, simply put, it lets us use asynchronous data. So any data that will resolve or that we'll have to wait to resolve. And we need to wrap it in this function because Nuxt needs to manage that and make sure that when we do server-side rendering, and then that gets hydrated and then rendered again on the client, that whole process works cleanly. And we want to make sure that we're doing things like deduplicating HTTP calls. So we're not making extra requests that we don't need to, that we're not making a request on the server and then on the client immediately making that same request, but that we're conserving and making things more efficient. So there's a bunch of different stuff going on under the hood here. But this use async data composable is really just a very generic way of handling asynchronous data. And all that we need is some sort of function, any function, as long as it returns a promise. And so that's what this fetch function does here, is it returns a promise. So we are able to use it in our use async data. And so we've shown that these two things here, use fetch and use async data with this fetch command, are functionally equivalent. So why do we have both of these if they do the same thing? Well, if you think about your applications that you're building, the vast majority of the async data that you're working with actually comes in the form of these fetch requests. And so to make that main use case as easy to use as possible, Nuxt combines these two things into the use fetch command. And so instead of using the use async data with the $fetch everywhere, which is a little bit more verbose, a little bit more complicated, we can just use the use fetch composable. Those edge cases where you're not directly using a URL might come from if you're using a library to fetch data, or you have some other functions that you're borrowing from another project or something like that, where you're not providing a URL directly, but instead getting some sort of promise from somewhere else. And so that's when the use async data composable is helpful. All right, so in this lesson, we went through the basics of data fetching in Nuxt, how the use fetch composable works, how use async data works with the $fetch isomorphic fetch. And we've described a little bit and gone through a little bit how these two things differ and when you might want to use one over the other. In the next lesson, we will dive a bit deeper into data fetching, and eventually we'll also add in a composable to fetch that course metadata, which we already created the endpoint for.